The International Monetary Fund has released its Sub-Saharan Economic Outlook report. It's called Living on the Edge. What do you mean by living on the edge? On the edge of what?
It's a very good question. So overall, I think a fairly difficult time for the region now. Thankfully, countries were not hit as bad by the health effects of the pandemic, but of course the economic toll on the region was really awful. And last year, finally, the region was beginning to put, the full effects of the pandemic behind it and beginning to grow. And we saw growth accelerating to 4.1%. But this year, that has, reversed, and so we are projecting growth to decelerate, to slow to 3.6%. So really difficult, and in a region which needs to grow by 7-8%, honestly, to make a difference in poverty reduction, address the improvements in living standards that are needed. This decline is really awful and really points to a very difficult year. And we've characterized it as living on the edge because really households, families really are exhausting their buffers. And in fact, we are actually seeing food insecurity increasing in some parts of the region. And when you look at the situation of many governments' finances, many, not all, I should stress, you're seeing a lot of strains. Governments, not having enough resources to be able to, not enough resources to be able to continue spending on health, education, exactly because they are facing a lot of short-term pressures from needing to provide more food imports, needing to, facing very high food import bills. So we wanted to paint a picture where countries are exhausting all their buffers, all their resources, and reaching, the end of their tethers, as it were.
You said in your report that Sub-Saharan Africa is projected to grow by 3.6% in 2022. That's more than 1% slower than in 2021. How does Africa as a region fare or compare with other regions in the world?
So, 3.6%, on the face of it, if you were in Europe, etc., you would kill for that. But for Sub-Saharan Africa, it really is, just a little above, or in aggregate, population growth rate. So in real terms, it's very low. And as I said earlier, it's a region that really needs to be growing much faster to catch up with the rest of the world, but also to alleviate all of the, poverty that we need, and also, even to close the gap that was created as a result of the pandemic affecting the economies so much adversely. So, it really is a number that nobody should be satisfied with.
You also say 19 of Africa's 35 low-income countries are in debt distress or at high risk of distress. Now, some countries, of course, turn to the IMF for help, but not all of them have done so. Why are some countries doing it, and why are some countries not turning to the IMF? Are there requirements they do not meet?
It's a good question. First and foremost, we're there to help countries when conditions are really difficult or when they come to support us. There's no obligation for countries to come and use the financing that we can provide. But importantly, short of that, we do engage with countries in a lot of other ways. Policy advice, so we have a lot of countries in that setting, but we also provide a lot of capacity development support, how to strengthen central banks, how to put in place a better tax policy environment so governments can provide more resources. Now, but when countries are faced with a difficult circumstance, they do turn to us because we would provide by far the cheapest source of financing that is available. There are a few countries where engagement is difficult as a result of, political transition issues or, debt being unsustainable. But even in those cases, provided they have requested support, we are working with them actively. So it's a matter of time when we can address the debt issue before we can present the program to the board. And why debt is really is important, addressing debt is important, is what you're touching on by highlighting, there are a number of countries in actual debt distress and others that have to be a bit more careful about how they proceed. Addressing debt issues when it's clearly unsustainable is important because, otherwise the resources we provide will go towards servicing unsustainable debt rather than helping the country. And we, of course, want the country to be helped. It's very important that debt issues are addressed upfront as soon as it's clear that the debt is unsustainable.
What are the signs that a country is in debt distress?
This is an assessment done on a country-specific basis, and taking into account what the growth outlook is, prospects for the economy, prospects for income. So we do something called a debt sustainability analysis in each country case when a country asks for support. It's on the basis of that we have a discussion about where the debt pressures are. So one indicator, for example, is the share of tax revenues that goes towards servicing debt. Is it reasonable or not? Because the higher the share of revenue that the government uses to pay debt, it crowds out spending on health, on education, or infrastructure. So that's why there are a series of indicators like this, and it's both looking at the numbers, but also judgment is involved. Will the government be able to address this through new tax measures? So quite a few variables that have to be taken.
What are those tax measures? What are you should countries be looking at taxing? Luxury goods, exports?
Taxation is spending too, is a deeply domestic and deeply political issue. So what we identify really is, when we work with countries, how much potential tax collection, scope for tax collection is, and are they approaching that potential? What might be the factors that are not there? But in terms of what the balance of tax handles they want to use, of course, I think is a deeply domestic thing. Now we do want there are basic principles that are really important to adhere to. So I think taxes need to be equitable and progressive. Why? Because we've seen countries with regressive taxes or where income inequality is high, not growing so rapidly, being unstable, which comes back to of course affect fiscal balances. So there are certain principles like the efficiency of the tax system, the fact that it's progressive and equitable, the fact that it's acceptable to everybody. There are certain principles that of course are important, I think, but within those parameters, it's for governments to do and choose what they want to do. Now we do share a lot of provide a lot of technical assistance that shows countries have found it effective to do tax collection using this digitalization approach or this set of area, and we provide a lot of information, but really fundamentally it's going to be up to countries. And of course there's a lot of country specificity as to what tax handles would make the most sense.
Are there some African countries that will simply never be in a position where they could get an IMF loan for help?
It's difficult for me to think that. I mean, so the reason countries turn to us is either when they face like a severe shock in the context of the pandemic, or a lot of countries that normally wouldn't come to the IMF came to us. Why? Because markets were shut down, because the crisis was really an acute once in 100-year shock. So when you have shocks like that, or even smaller and country-specific shocks, countries turn to us. Another set of reasons countries turn to us is because they have economic imbalances that they want to address. Okay, so, and it's not unique to Africa. I mean, so I don't know if you remember in the Euro area crisis, where countries like Greece, Portugal, Ireland turning to the IMF. Countries when they're facing these economic imbalances turn to us, and we have these programs. Quite a few countries in the region already we're working with to address economic imbalances. Most recently, Ghana asked for such a program. So that's another set of countries. And looking forward, going forward, we now have a new facility called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which has been created through the rechanneling of SDRs from richer countries to countries that need the resources more. And the purpose behind this Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which most middle-income and low-income countries are eligible to, is to help address pandemic preparedness and climate change issues in the long term. So again, this is a new instrument that we're looking to use to support our countries to increase resilience. I think that's one of the key things that's emerging from the lessons of the last couple of years, that climate change in particular cannot wait. Okay, these low-frequency events like pandemics, which we think will never happen, do happen, and when they happen, they create huge issues. So, that's also another area we're working with and hope to work with many more countries in the coming years.
Is the IMF the bank of last resort?
Some people do describe us like that, and for sovereigns that are in difficult position, we are indeed the entity that they tend to turn to us, and again, that's why we were created.
And you're saying to countries, come to us for help
when they need it. Absolutely.
I wonder if you can explain for us in very simple terms, a term we hear a lot is debt restructuring. So for those of us who are not economists or professors or central bankers, what does it entail?
It can entail a number of things. In most Sub-Saharan African countries, the primary driver of debt challenges is the level of indebtedness of the public sector. And for some, when debt becomes unreasonably high, in some cases it would suffice to reprofile the debt. So the repayment, if it's bunching up over the next 2-3 years, can be spread out over a much longer period. So can be, reprofiled is the term of art. In other cases, it just cannot be repaid quite clearly. So in those cases, the government often gets into discussion with its creditors to ask that some of the debt be cancelled and spread out over a longer time period so that it can be repaid. So that's typically what we're talking about when we're talking about debt.
And you've outlined 4 priorities for policymakers in Africa going forward. You may have alluded to some of these earlier in the conversation, but can you briefly share with us those recommendations?
Absolutely. So, right now, of course, social protection, addressing the pressures, cost of living increase that our people are facing right now, and outright food insecurity, which has gone up in many cases, either because of particular shocks. So in the Horn, in the Sahel, we've seen, really distressing situation with food insecurity increasing very sharply. So addressing that is really important, and governments need to do what they have to do to make sure that they intervene to support people. So we think that's an important priority. Second, inflation is accelerated in the region in the vast majority of countries. So this also needs to be addressed head on. Now, I think it's a sign of the progress that the region has made that honestly, inflation has not been an issue for 15, 16 years in the vast majority of countries. It used to, of course, in the 80s, 90s, even through the mid-2000s. It was a big issue in many countries. But of late, policies have been conducted well. But now we're seeing inflation emerging as a big issue, and I think central banks need to be a lot more focused on addressing inflation. Why is inflation important? Again, it is an insidious tax which undermines and undercuts the incomes of the poorest people often, who live on fixed incomes, are unable to escape this inflation tax. So it really is not just a technical issue, but really something that goes to the issue of the cost of living. A third priority, I think, is for governments to increasingly look for ways to make sure that they don't, tip over the edge in terms of debt sustainability challenges, because it can really compound all of the other crises that they're facing. So fiscal reforms, tax revenue mobilization. If debt is already, it's clear that it's unsustainable, looking for ways to reprofile that debt. So fiscal reforms, another important component of what needs to be done. And then finally, even as countries are doing this, we cannot forget about the need to build resilience, so that resilience to climatic shock type challenges, resilience to food supply shortages that we've seen. So investing perhaps a bit more on agriculture so that we have better production. So all of those issues need attention. To be very clear, I remain deeply, deeply optimistic about
I was going to ask you about
the region's economic trajectory over the future. But we have a difficult moment, and unless we find a way to deal with that, we delay how quickly we're able to tap the potential, and yet another year or two of kids coming out of school that don't have as nice, as jobs, the right type of jobs, so, or even, unable to complete school. So it really is a pressing challenge that needs to be addressed in order to be able to make sure that we're on a higher growth trajectory.